I speak to a lot of different audiences, and some are very hostile to what I do, and some are very receptive. So I work for a human rights organization. I work for the American Civil Liberties Union. We are one of the oldest human rights groups in the United States. I work for a team of attorneys that do most of our surveillance litigation. We sue largely the US government, the federal and state components for violating people's human rights, and specifically I work on the team that sues them over surveillance. My boss is one of Snowden's lawyers, and so you might imagine that I have a particular perspective on these surveillance issues that have come to light in the last year. And I give lots of talks. I give talks around the world to very, very different audiences, and it's useful for me to understand the kind of audience that I'm speaking to. I understand that this is a very technical audience, but I do want to ask one question before I begin my presentation. Again, I know it's difficult to get people to interact here, but if I could get a show of hands, how many people in the room think that Edward Snowden is a justified whistleblower? A justified whistleblower. Show of hands for Edward Snowden. Okay, I think I can get some idea. And then how many people think he's a traitor who should be in jail? I don't see any hands. No? Okay, all right. And how many people didn't raise their hand before? Okay. That at least helps me to better understand how this is going to work out. I gave a talk maybe 2 months ago to an audience of Russian security researchers who work for Kaspersky. Their CEO had said that Snowden belonged in the deepest layer of hell. So you might imagine that I got a bit of a cold reception there. All right, so I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a bit of a history lesson to help you understand the relationship that you have to the companies who now provide you with the technology that you depend on. The first part of this story is to tell you about something that happened when I was in high school. So this was really before I was aware of these issues. And this is what is commonly known now as the crypto wars, although I suspect as the history books evolve, this will eventually become known as the first crypto wars. I think we're actually going through the second one right now. All right, so this is Louis Freeh. Louis Freeh was the director of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the 90s, Freeh had a particular bee in his bonnet. Freeh was deeply concerned about encryption technology. So for those of you who weren't aware at this time, weren't in the industry, weren't focused on these issues, the US and many other countries heavily regulated cryptography, cryptographic technology. In many countries, it's still regulated actually as a munition, as a weapon. And so in the 90s, there were sort of two parallel debates taking place. The first debate was whether cryptography should be allowed to be exchanged around the world, to be exported to all countries. And then a related debate was the extent to which governments could control cryptography, the extent to which governments could maintain high-quality, strong cryptography for their own means, while ensuring that the people who might do bad things, and thus everyone, because they didn't know who were going to do bad things, to make sure that everyone would have very, very weak cryptography that governments could find ways to bypass or circumvent. So this is Louis Freeh testifying before Congress in the mid-90s, the FBI director. I'm just going to read you a few of the things he said. The widespread use of robust, non-key recovery encryption ultimately will devastate our ability to fight crime and prevent terrorism. He added, uncrackable encryption will allow drug lords, spies, terrorists, and even violent gangs to communicate about their crimes and their conspiracies with impunity. If you could imagine a more evil technology, I personally couldn't imagine what that would be, but Freeh, when testifying before the US Senate, and you have to understand here, politicians generally are not that tech savvy, right? So this is a senior law enforcement official, the guy at the very top of the most important law enforcement agency in the country, coming before a congressional panel and telling them about how this doomsday technology will allow the worst of the worst to hide from the government. As you might imagine, the people who were charged with representing the people in Congress, they were terrified. This technology terrified them. But Freeh had a solution. In his congressional testimony, he proposed a way forward. The only acceptable answer is socially responsible encryption products that permit timely law enforcement and national security access and decryption pursuant to a court order or otherwise authorized by law. Socially responsible cryptography. Jake is laughing at the front of the room because he has a twisted sense of humor. It's true. It's fair trade crypto, although it's actually Walmart crypto. So Free's solution was this. This is called the Clipper chip. And the idea here was government-blessed technology, government-designed cryptography that would protect your calls from the bad guys, but still allow the state to listen to you when they saw fit. And the general idea here was that there would be a copy of the encryption keys stored with a third party, a neutral third party. They would have everyone's encryption keys on file. And then when prosecutors had some reason to believe that you were doing something you shouldn't be doing, the police could go, obtain the keys, listen to the calls, and everything would be fine. And the government really, really wanted the Clipper chip to take off. This would give people some assurance that their identities weren't being stolen, that their credit card numbers were safe as they were communicating them over the phone, but this would also ensure that terrorists and pedophiles and drug dealers could not, in fact, hide their crimes with impunity. So the Clipper chip didn't really work out the way that the NSA hoped it would. The NSA designed the algorithm in the Clipper chip. It turned out that the algorithm wasn't very good. And so there was actually a pretty critical flaw in the Clipper chip. It didn't even protect you from the threats that it was alleged, that was intended to protect you from. And so Clipper failed. It failed in the market. It failed for political reasons. It failed for technical reasons. And so the FBI's proposal to have backdoored crypto, not secret backdoored, but open backdoored, that was not a success. And at the same time, there was this huge debate taking place in the United States and around the world about whether governments should maintain this death grip around cryptographic technology or whether they should allow it to flow across borders. Depending on your perspective, either the human rights and free speech argument won out, or probably what is more likely the case is that commercial interests won out. US companies complained that they had a tough time selling their products in Europe and in other markets because they were only allowed to sell weakened versions of their products. There was a strong version for the US market and a weakened version for every other market in the world. And of course, the Russians and European companies could come along and sell much better technology. So eventually, you had the rules change. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed an executive order that was really the beginning of the end for cryptographic export controls. And in the few years that followed, things changed in several other countries too. And so you eventually had the US government granting an official license to allow technology like PGP, pretty good privacy, to be freely and legitimately exported around the world, except, with a few exceptions like Cuba and Sudan. And so what happened? Louis Freeh had warned the Congress about this horrible world, about this horrible thing that would happen once the bad guys got their hands on PGP. Right? And what happened? Did the bad guys start using PGP? Did terrorists and pedophiles and drug dealers suddenly start encrypting their communications? No. But it isn't for the reasons, it wasn't because Freeh was a liar. It wasn't because the bad guys probably didn't want to use this technology. I suspect it's probably because they couldn't figure out how to use it. And so because of that reason, PGP has not been the problem for the government that Freeh warned it would be. This is a very famous paper in the academic world by Alma Witten, who was then a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, went on to become sort of the top privacy and security manager at Google. It's called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. This paper really was one of the first big papers in the world of usable security, an analysis of what happens when regular people sit down and try and use encryption software. Now, this paper's old. This paper, I think, is maybe 12, 13 years old now. The interface for PGP has obviously changed a little bit since this was first written. This slide, or this screenshot was, I think, from 1998, and the key sizes for some people's keys have increased a little bit, but not as much as they probably should have. But the interface actually hasn't changed that much. The interface for PGP was really confusing in 1998, and it's still really confusing in 2014. And Alma's work showed that when regular people sit down and use this software, they have troubles. They have serious conceptual troubles with wrapping their heads around things like public key encryption. Right? And when regular people cannot figure out how to use this stuff, a few bad things happen. So the first bad thing is they give up. They don't even try and use it, which actually, on the spectrum of possible bad things, is probably the best thing that can happen, because at least then they don't think they're safe. The worst thing that can happen is they think they're using it properly, and they're in fact not. In her paper, she describes several doomsday scenarios, users sending their private keys instead of sending their public keys, people using signatures instead of using encryption. But what she pointed to was the fact that usability problems in many cases either prevent the use, the installation, or the correct use of this technology. And things haven't really gotten that much better in the last 12, 13 years. There are some exceptions, and Jake mentioned one of them in his talk, OTR, which is probably the most successful communications encryption program to date. But if people cannot figure out how to use this stuff, then it's not really going to be a problem for the government. This is one of the slides. This is one of the slides that was published by the press last year. I think the date of this is from 2009. This is a GCHQ slide. And so again, put yourself in the shoes of the government. This is I imagine a room something like this, except that you're all spooks. This is a spy conference, and you're all sharing information with each other and talking about your successes and failures, what's going well, what's not going well. And some guy on the stage, GCHQ guy, is giving this presentation, and he's talking about about much of the traffic on the web, the traffic that they're focusing on. And in 2009, the big services that everyone was using, Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, Google, all of them were sending their users' data over the net in clear text. In 2009, these billion-dollar companies were still sending their users' private information over the internet without any degree of protection at all. Which meant that massive bulk surveillance was not a difficult problem. I mean, there was an engineering problem, right? How do you collect this vast quantity of information? How do you process it? How do you organize it? But there wasn't an encryption problem to be dealt with. I think the idea that many of us have in our heads of the intelligence agencies, the NSA, or the precursor to NSA in the 1940s in World War II, the British and the Americans breaking the Germans' Enigma machine, right? Code breakers. That wasn't taking place in 2009. I mean, there were things that they were breaking, but our communications didn't require code breaking because there weren't any codes that were being used. And so HTTPS, although it has existed for some time in various versions, it hasn't really been a problem for the intelligence community or for law enforcement because much of our communications weren't protected at all. There are some industries that protected their customers' information, banks, healthcare providers, insurance companies, that kind of thing. But the companies to whom we entrust our most private and sensitive information, email providers, social networking companies, they didn't bother to lift a finger to protect their customers' information. And so the real result was that governments gorged themselves. They gorged themselves on this never-ending buffet of people's personal and private information. And of course, they couldn't do this alone, right? As much as, in my country, the NSA has a $10 billion annual budget, which is pretty significant. It's huge compared to everyone else's. But the NSA couldn't do what they do by themselves. They need help. And the companies who provided the most help are the companies that operate our international telecommunications networks, the companies that operate the fiber optic cables that go between continents, the companies that provide us with our telephone service, with our internet service. Right? These companies have a 100-year-old relationship with the intelligence community, with law enforcement, with governments. These are the most heavily regulated industries. They cannot sneeze without the permission of the government. And they need the government's help and assistance for all kinds of things, whether it's mergers, whether it's spectrum. Right? Every time a wireless company wants to build a new cell tower, they have to get a license from a telecommunications operator. And so that gives governments a degree of coercive power over these companies that few other companies face. And of course, what they've done is they've given the government everything they've asked for and then some. In many ways, I think the relationship between these companies and the government could be described as best friends forever. Right? They really are on the same side. They see themselves as being on the same side. And what this means then is effective surveillance. Because these companies have access to most of our private data, typically going through their networks without any form of encryption. So back in 2009, this friendly relationship was enough. This friendly relationship was enough to allow the NSA and GCHQ and other major intelligence agencies to get everything they'd ever want and more. And then something changed. Beginning in 2010, technology started to make things a little bit more difficult for the intelligence community. January 12, 2010, Google turned on HTTPS by default. This option had existed for a decade. Ever since Gmail first was open to the public, they had transport encryption as an option for users. You had to dig through an obscure settings menu. It was the 13th of 13 configuration options after Unicode keyboard settings and the vacation auto away. If you imagine the user interface, the design of the user interface as a form of communication to the user, the fact that this encryption option was disabled by default and in the 13th of 13 options, I think conveyed to users who would ever stumble across this that it wasn't very important. In fact, there was nothing less important in the user interface than this encryption option. And so prior to January 2010, it had been available, but very few people had turned it on, which meant that most users' communications were just there to be taken. And in January of 2010, Google made the switch. And the reasons that Google did this are very complex, and we don't really need to go into it now, but what matters is they did this. They did this, and it didn't require any action by any Google user. On January 11th, everyone's communications were open and available to state surveillance. And on January 12th, suddenly governments had to work a little bit harder. I'm not saying it protected people 100%, it definitely didn't. But suddenly the intelligence community had to work a bit harder. And you could imagine that on January 12th, 2010, there were probably a few unhappy people at Fort Meade, Maryland. In the next year or two that followed, other big Silicon Valley tech companies followed suit. First Twitter, then Microsoft Outlook, then Facebook, Google Search went encrypted. Even took a little while, took until January of this year, but Yahoo eventually followed. And what that's meant is that surveillance has become more difficult. Surveillance performed with the help of the backbone operators. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that governments no longer have a way of getting Google communications, and I'll get into that a bit more in a minute. But what it's meant is that the traditional tight relationship between the Verizons, the AT&Ts, the Vodafones of the world, or Vodacom as you guys call it here, the relationship between those companies and the state no longer gives the government everything. In the past, the telecom companies were a one-stop shop where governments could go and get the contents of users' communications, metadata, location information, social network data, everything that they would ever need about their own populations and others, they could go to the telecom providers for. And as these Silicon Valley tech companies, for various reasons, many motivated by self-interest, as they deployed network-based transport encryption, the status quo changed. And the relationship with the Verizons and level 3 communications of the world became less useful. Now, they're still in bed with them, but they're no longer as useful. So this is one of the most interesting slides that was published last year. This, of course, set the tech community on fire when it was first published. And what this really revealed was in many ways the greedy nature of the intelligence agencies. Right? So every Silicon Valley tech company has a legal compliance team. That's the fancy word for the surveillance team. And they're typically run by a former US government lawyer, ex-DOJ lawyer, a bunch of paralegals, and their job every day is to respond to surveillance requests. Google receives thousands of requests a year, Yahoo, Facebook. They all receive requests, and when the US government or a foreign government following the appropriate rules in their country, when they get the right piece of paper, whether signed by a judge or whatever kangaroo court they have in their own country, when they get that order, they go to Google, and Google hands over the data. And from Google's perspective, they felt like they were following the rules. Right? They are forced to provide this information, and they felt like they were giving the NSA everything the NSA was asking for. And then when this slide was made public, it revealed that, in fact, the NSA was going through the front door and then going through the back door at the same time. They were getting everything they were allowed to get with the court order through the front door and then stealing everything else through the back door. And of course, the response from Google and Twitter and Facebook and these other tech companies was to say, oh, I guess we should have been encrypting our internal data center traffic. We'd always known about the threats. We'd always known that this was potential weakness in our network, but it was a relatively low priority. And so, again, the Silicon Valley tech companies deployed encryption. First, HTTPS between the user and the service provider, then a different form of network encryption between the respective data centers of the companies. But what we see over the last couple of years is a slow march towards transport encryption. This is a fantastic survey that EFF has been doing for the last year or so. It's called their Encrypt the Web report. And really what they're doing is sort of surveying all of the big tech companies to see where they are with various forms of privacy-enhancing technology. I'm not going to say that these companies are doing a great thing. Many of them still have much room to improve. But this sea of green that you see, a year and a half ago would have been a sea of red. The last year's worth of Snowden stories have, for many reasons, pushed the tech companies to improve their security. Maybe they felt insulted, felt under attack. I'm not going to try and get into the minds of the engineers in these companies, but what is clear is that over the last year, Silicon Valley companies have tightened things up a bit. They've started to encrypt. They've started to use better forms of encryption. They've transitioned to perfect forward secrecy algorithms, which ensure that keys that are stolen cannot be used to allow the decryption of previous communications. Now, we're not perfect, by any means. Even the low-hanging fruit that's sitting on the tree hasn't all been harvested. So, for example, even though many of the big tech companies are using HTTPS between your computer and their servers, when you log into Gmail and you send an email to one of your friends, if they're not also using Gmail, it's likely that the email at some point will be going unencrypted over a public network. This is a chart that was put together last summer revealing whether or not the big name service providers are using something called Start TLS, which is the email server encryption. In the last few months, Yahoo has actually started to use it, but Microsoft and AOL still do not use this, which means if you're emailing a Hotmail user or an Outlook user, at some point, a three-letter agency is going to get their hands on those emails. Now, to be clear, this isn't a difficult problem to solve. This is something that Microsoft could fix very easily, and it's something they've promised to fix, I think, by the third quarter of this year. But what this means is that even the most basic things that could be fixed have not yet been fixed. But encryption will make life more difficult for the state. It will raise the cost of surveillance. But I want to be clear, even when Start TLS is used by every service provider, even when certificate pinning is in use, when strong key sizes, when perfect forward secrecy, when all of these various knobs and buttons that can be twiddled and tweaked to optimize transport security have been implemented, the NSA won't go blind. And I'm not talking about, for now, what Jake was describing, where they switch from passive surveillance to targeted attacks. The reason that this won't cause the NSA to go blind, the reason this won't cause the British government, the French, the Israelis to go blind, is they can still go through the front door. Right, so this slide was one of the first that was published, both by The Guardian and the Washington Post, and of course, this was the real, it's one of the huge moments in the early part of the surveillance debate, because finally we had the names of these companies being revealed as collaborators. The big companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts of the world, companies that have advertised themselves as privacy leaders, being revealed to be secretly collaborating with the NSA. And of course the companies said, we've never heard of this PRISM program, which is true, because they don't get told the code name. They say we're not sharing our customers' information with the NSA, which is true. They're sharing it with the FBI, which then provides it to the NSA. It's cool how you do that, right? When you have a bunch of lawyers on both sides, you can make denials that are not really denials. But what this program actually revealed is the method by which the intelligence services demand data from private companies. And the SSL, the transport encryption that's being rolled out, the email server encryption that's being rolled out, it won't stop PRISM or things like it, because the companies keep our data on their servers. Really what's happening is that the companies are becoming a more effective bottleneck. They've decided that if the state is going to get their users' data, the state has to go through them. What they're not content with is the state going to Verizon, or AT&T, or Level 3, or Vodafone. They want to be the sole source through which the intelligence community and law enforcement can get their customers' information. But what they're not interested in doing is moving to a world in which the state cannot get their users' information. And the reasons for this are also complicated. I think partially it's a business model thing. I think also many of the executives of the companies don't really see themselves as activists fighting the surveillance state. They see themselves as businessmen and women who are there to make money. This is Vint Cerf, sort of one of the grandfathers or fathers of the internet, co-created TCP/IP. I mean, technology that we all use. He's now a high-ranking executive at Google. And a couple years ago, I was in Nairobi on a panel with Vint, and we were talking to this public global audience about why Google doesn't encrypt the data that it stores. Right? Why doesn't Google encrypt your emails, your search records, such that only you have access to them? The technology to do this exists, and it's existed for some time, but Google has never deployed this. And he said, we couldn't run our system if everything in it were encrypted, because then we wouldn't know which ads to show you. This is a system that was designed around a particular business model. I have a deep amount of respect for Vint's contributions to our technology culture. I also have a huge amount of respect for his honesty at this event. This is something that his legal colleagues would never say in public. That really what it comes down to is that the companies to whom we entrust our most private and sensitive information, in many cases, are advertising companies. Right? Google is not an email provider or a search engine. They're an advertising company that uses email and all these other things to draw in our eyeballs. What that means then is there are certain kinds of privacy protections that they can roll out that are complementary to their business model. So turning on HTTPS by default didn't really hurt Google's ability to make money. It might have cost them a little bit of money for some server time or some engineering time, but they could still mine all of our data. In many ways, it actually helped their business model because it meant that these parasitic telecommunications companies couldn't also mine their customers' information for advertising purposes. But the technologies, the technical methods that would protect our information from Google, the company will never roll out. at least right now, where the business model is one in which we give them our data and they give us services in return. Furthermore, the business models aside, these companies are just okay with their role in the surveillance state. They're okay with the government coming through the front door. They're just not crazy about the state getting things through the back door. Late last year, a bunch of big tech companies announced an initiative. It's called Reform Government Surveillance. There's a website for it, which is called reformgovernmentsurveillance.com. And it's the big ones: Apple, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Twitter, Microsoft, LinkedIn. The biggest of the Silicon Valley tech companies all joined together to put out this statement about the imbalance in our surveillance laws in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And they called for these principles to be adopted by states around the world. Specific targeted surveillance. So this is one of the principles. They said governments should limit surveillance to specific known users for lawful purposes and should not undertake bulk data collection of internet communications. So look, it's good that Google is opposed to bulk surveillance. But what they're not opposed to is the government coming to them with the right kind of piece of paper and demanding users' information. They're not, at a policy level, Google is okay with the state showing up with a piece of paper and saying, give us this person's information and don't tell them that we came. This is, of course, Eric Schmidt. So I've been working on surveillance for maybe 8 years, and you work in the area of privacy and security, and eventually you get a favorite Eric Schmidt quote, because he likes to put, or I don't know if he likes to, but he definitely puts his foot in his mouth very frequently. One of my favorite Schmidt quotes was one in which he was talking to National Public Radio, our public radio broadcaster in the United States. He said, the reason we keep search engine data for any length of time is, one, we actually need it to make our algorithms better, but more importantly, there's a legitimate case of the government or the police wanting with a federal subpoena to be able to get access to that information. This is Eric Schmidt, 2009, talking about the company keeping data to provide it to law enforcement. And it doesn't get any clearer than this, right? They are okay with handing over your information. They just don't want to do it too much, and they only want to do it on a case-by-case basis about individual users. So, over the last couple of years, the Silicon Valley companies have tightened things up to make life more difficult for the states. They have done everything possible to force the state to go through the front door instead of the back door. They've rolled out encryption technology, much of which is actually now being used by hundreds of millions of users because it's turned on by default. They have dealt with, in some cases, the PGP problem because users don't have to think about crypto anymore. It's not the best kind of crypto, but they don't have to think about it. It's just there. It's turned on. You log into Gmail or you log into Twitter, and suddenly your data is going over the network in encrypted form. Given where the state started, given Freeh's statements to Congress, Louis Freeh's statements in the 90s about encryption being this evil, criminal facilitating technology, we can imagine that the surveillance apparatus are not going to just sit idly by as encryption technologies make their way into the hands of users and actually start getting used. This was one of the, I think, most important yet largely overlooked stories that was published last summer by Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and a few of their colleagues, revealing that Microsoft and Skype, Microsoft now and previously Skype when it was an independent company, had collaborated with the National Security Agency and the FBI to weaken the security of their product. For years, Skype had advertised itself as a secure product. If you went to an event where there was someone from Skype present, one of their legal or policy people, and you asked them if they could wiretap their customers' information, they said, no, we deliver end-to-end encrypted communications. We don't have access to our users' keys. You know, we are not in that business. But they are in that business. And, you know, this story that Glenn and the others published clearly revealed that Skype had modified their service to make it possible for the FBI to wiretap Skype users. According to the article, Skype was served with a directive to comply by the Attorney General. So I'm not going to get into the weeds of the law in the US. In many cases, we don't really know the interpretations of the law that DOJ is relying on. But suffice to say that the US government believes that they can go to any technology company and demand the kind of assistance that would be the end of the company. If you're a company and you're delivering secure services to your users, if the one thing you promise is encryption, in Skype's case, encryption for free, DOJ believes they can come along and demand that you insert a secret backdoor in your product. And I think this is really chilling. Regardless of your views on surveillance, regardless of your views on whether the NSA is legitimately monitoring everyone around the world or whether they're violating people's privacy, just as people in the technology industry, I think this should be really worrying. I think it should be really worrying to learn what the state can do with these secret and powerful orders. This is Brad Smith, who is Microsoft's general counsel, the most important and powerful lawyer at Microsoft. And after the Skype story was first published, he responded to the allegations in a very, I think, important way. He said, quote, as internet-based voice and video communications increase, it is clear that governments will have an interest in using or establishing legal powers to secure access to this kind of content to investigate crimes or tackle terrorism. But then he added, we therefore assume that all calls, whether over the internet or by fixed line or mobile phone, will offer similar levels of privacy and security. This is a long statement, so let's unpack this for a moment. There is no privacy in your landline calls. The state can monitor those at will whenever they wish to by going to your national telecommunications operators. Your mobile phones have even less security. The encryption that your cell phone is using was probably created in 1986 and then broken in 1996 by graduate students. The encryption algorithms that are still in widespread use in GSM are hopelessly broken. And so for the general counsel of Microsoft, for Microsoft's top lawyer to say that their software communications platform, Skype, will offer the same degree of privacy and security as your landline or wireless phone is basically them giving up. We're not even going to try. Microsoft is not going to try to deliver end-to-end strong encryption communications to you or to anyone else, and likely the other big companies are not either. And this is, I think, a really powerful thing that really wasn't, people really didn't fully grasp this when Brad Smith was saying this. All right, so you have the Microsofts of the world who've been ordered to help. You have companies that I guess can be paid to do things. Obviously, RSA came up earlier this morning, and it was big news in December when the story first broke. You know, it was really surprising when that story first hit the news because the sum of money that was alleged to have been provided to RSA, $10 million, was really small. I mean, for a large company with an important, trusted brand, $10 million to subvert the security of your product is pretty small change. You know, we don't know everything that happened in that exchange. The CEO or the chairman of RSA spoke this February at the RSA conference, and it seems like the approach that he took in his public remarks was one in which the company was duped. So instead of being evil, they have just said they were ignorant. We thought we were working with the NSA. We thought the NSA was helping us to design a more secure product. The NSA lied to us. I'm not sure how this furthers RSA's interests, or the RSA's business interests, to portray themselves as dumb instead of evil. But I think even if we believe what the chairman of RSA said, I think the $10 million is actually not that important. I think what is far more likely to happen is that the CEO of a company is approached by the director of the NSA, by some senior US government official, and they're taken aside and said, look, we need you to do the right thing. There are really bad people using this technology. We need you to be a patriotic American. And I think for many people, when they don't have to think about what's going to happen 3 or 4 steps down the road, that kind of request is intoxicating. How do you say no to the director of the NSA when he gets on an airplane and flies across the country just to meet with you? And he assures you that what you're doing will keep your country safe. And these kinds of requests are no doubt happening every day in the United States. And I'm sure they're happening in your own country. I'm sure they're happening in European countries and in China and in Russia and in Israel. What happens when, the government asks you to do this thing that probably isn't going to be very good for your reputation, but they assure you that it will never become public. It'll be a state secret. No one will ever know, and you will silently be fighting the good fight. And I don't think we've really grasped this as an industry, that these kinds of requests happen all the time. That the companies, not to whom we entrust our private data, but the companies to whom we rely on for data security, the companies that build the software and appliances that protect our networks, that these companies get these quiet requests just to do the right thing. And I think it really fundamentally threatens the stability of the entire industry, right? The only thing you're selling is trust, and the state can subvert that trust either through force, through bribery, through coercion, or polite request. This was, I'm sorry you can't see this in greater detail, this was one of the Bull Run slides that was published, revealing that part of NSA's mission is to insert vulnerabilities into commercial encryption systems, IT systems, network, endpoint communications devices used by targets. These are the same products that you're all using, right? And so one thing that's really different between the 1945 Enigma machine scenario, right? The Axis and Allied powers fighting it out. In 1945, there were specialized encryption machines used by state governments, by the Germans, by the Japanese, by the Americans, by the Brits. But today, that's not really the case. There are, some encrypted communications devices that are only used by governments, but many of the people that the intelligence services want to monitor feel like it's their mission and duty to monitor. They're using the same technology that we all rely on. They're using the same web browsers, they're using the same word processing programs, they're using the same operating systems. There are no terrorist laptops, there are no drug dealer cell phones. Right? We're all relying on the same technology, in many cases provided by United States companies or Chinese companies. And so what that means then is for the intelligence services to have the means to monitor the truly bad people, the people that they think they are justified in monitoring. They must have the ability to monitor the rest of us too. And for an industry such as yours that's building secure software solutions to your customers, where you're promising that you can keep them safe, where you're promising that you can keep the bad guys out, what does it mean when you now have a target painted on your back? When the state is going after the technology that you're providing to your customers? And so the thing that's keeping me up at night right now, the threat that is sort of looming on the horizon isn't the NSA breaking into networks. It's not the state weakening cryptographic algorithms through their role in the standard setting process. The thing that is scaring me right now, and consuming a lot of my time, is worrying about the kinds of coercive orders that companies can receive from the state. So Silent Circle is a company that has a product very similar to the Redphone suite that Jake talked about. Redphone is a free open source Android app that lets you make encrypted telephone calls. Silent Circle is a quasi open source but not regularly updated open source app that you can pay $10 a month for and make encrypted audio calls and text messages. And they've positioned themselves as a provider of encrypted voice and text communications to Fortune 500 companies, to enterprise customers. If you want to make calls between an iOS device and an Android device right now, your C-level suite, you go to a company like Silent Circle. They are only in business for one reason, and that is to deliver encrypted communications to their customers. What does it mean then for the state to show up at Silent Circle's office and say, put a backdoor in your product? That means the end of the company. Now, the company has said very clearly that they have no government-mandated backdoors, that this is the opposite of why they would ever come together to create this product. But this threat is looming on the horizon. This threat of these orders is just sitting there. And Silent Circle say they've not received any requests like this, and I believe them. But you have to imagine that the existence of these kinds of products is probably something that people at three-letter agencies are not very happy about, right? Software like Silent Circle, point-and-click apps that you download through the App Store that suddenly you can make encrypted calls, or Redphone, these things scare the NSA. And they scare the FBI and local police even more. Because for all the tools and powers that the NSA has, the $10 billion a year annual budget, the local police don't have that. And they are really worried about the widespread use of these kinds of tools. Similarly, SpiderOak, which is a competitor of Dropbox. With Dropbox, you can back up your files in the cloud, but if you back up your files with Dropbox, the police can go to the company and compel them to hand over your information. SpiderOak has a different kind of model. You upload your files, but they're encrypted with a key that only you have. And so they say, we've created a system that makes it impossible for anyone to reveal your data, for us to reveal your data to anyone. Right? This company is only in business for one reason. The only reason you use them over Dropbox is the encryption promises that they have made. And if the FBI or DOJ can show up, or if your government can show up to the South African version of SpiderOak and say, put a backdoor in your product, steal your users' keys, give us their data, then they're toast. These kinds of orders are real. So LavaBit got a lot of press last year, and again, this story is very complicated, and LavaBit security, their actual technical security was not as good as they had promised, but this was a company that believed they were in business to offer secure email. One of their customers, a very high-profile customer, was targeted by the US government. And so they received this order. This court order came to them. This is a subpoena initially, and then the government followed up with a court order and a grand jury summons. And the important bit in this was saying, you are directed to bring the grand jury the public and private encryption keys used by lavabit.com. So LavaBit had 100,000 users, something like that. 400,000 users, sorry. And the government was looking for one of those users and demanded the company's private encryption keys. So many of you work for companies that have private encryption keys that are used for your own servers, for your websites, for your products, to deliver secure updates to your users. What would it mean if the state came to you and said, give us your keys? Give us your encryption keys. We promise to only use them for a very specific, important purpose. What would that mean? Would you fight? Would you do the right thing? Would you be a patriot? Would you share this information? Would you tell your users? Would you shut down your service like LavaBit did? I mean, for many companies, shutting down isn't an option. You have salaries to pay, you have contracts you've signed, you have SLAs, right? Shutting down is not an option. But as a security company, you cannot continue to operate when the state has forced you to hand over this most important piece of data that you have. This is the world we now live in. We now live in a world in which the intelligence services and law enforcement community can compel companies to hand over the most sensitive data they have, where the eventual disclosure of that, and it will eventually come out, where the eventual disclosure of that will destroy the company. And again, regardless of your views on what Edward Snowden has done in the last year, this should terrify you. This should terrify you. But luckily, there are ways around this. You can, if you adapt your threat model to this, you can plan ahead. You can have engineers in different countries, and the engineers have to agree when features are added. You can work with your lawyers to game this out. It's not the end of the world, but you should plan for these kinds of requests, because they are coming. This is Valerie Caproni. This is the last person I'm going to talk about in my presentation. She was the general counsel at the FBI until just a couple of years ago. She was the top lawyer at the FBI, and really when Louis Freeh was going to Congress and demonizing PGP, she was the one in the back room writing the legal memos to support what he was doing. She stayed at the Department of Justice and the FBI much longer than he did, and she left 2 years ago and is now a federal judge in New York, which is the way it works in the United States. So this is her speaking to the New York Times in September of 2010, talking about companies, tech companies. No one should be promising their customers that they will thumb their nose at a US court order. They can promise strong encryption. They just need to figure out how they can provide us the plain text. All right, so in this world, in a world where the top law enforcement lawyer believes that they can compel any company into handing over the unencrypted version of their users' data, how do you build secure services? How do you build secure products? I'm not talking about the threat of the NSA breaking into your systems. How do you protect yourself against the NSA's lawyers? or your own country's intelligence service lawyers. These are the kinds of threats that our industry is now going to have to deal with. I think it's possible to deal with them, but you have to at least start acknowledging that they're real and build them into your threat model. And so our threat model really has changed. I don't think many people in the industry are quite ready to accept this, but we need to start addressing it in the products that we build and the services that you're all providing to your users. Thank you very much.
Folks, in the interests of time, I'm going to limit this to one or two questions, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break or so just to stretch your legs and get a cup of coffee. Anybody in the audience? I know that we are running mics. There's a gentleman over here, and Jacob, you've spoken already. Okay, here we go. Get to you in a minute. Let's go here first. Over here, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. You mentioned that a lot of companies have moved their assets to the other countries that they actually service and that. And there's been a bit of a discussion, because I think it was a court ruling in Texas recently, where the judge basically stated that if it is a American registered company or it has assets registered in America, they have the right to then issue a subpoena, and no matter where it is located in the world, that data will be handed over.
So I think you're confusing something else that happened recently. So Microsoft received an order from the US government to hand over data that was stored in a Dublin data center. And Microsoft is fighting this. They're fighting it at the very lowest levels of the justice system right now. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a computer scientist, but it's my understanding that Microsoft is probably going to have a really tough fight. For obvious business reasons, Microsoft clearly wants to communicate to the market, don't worry, we can just keep your data in Europe if you're European business and it's safe from the US. I mean, I think the important thing to think about is where Microsoft's executives are, right? Where is the Microsoft C-suite? They're in Redmond, Washington. What happens when the FBI shows up there with an order and a gun? And are you going to see the CEO of Microsoft rotting in a jail cell to fight the request? It doesn't really matter where the user is. It matters where the engineers are who can, SSH in and get the data. My second favorite Eric Schmidt quote after the data retention one is at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, and he's asked by this American journalist, Rachel Maddow, why Google doesn't do more to protect its customers from the government, from the US government. And he says, there's a problem with expecting us to protect you from the government, and that's that the government has guns and we don't. I don't know if that was a call for a private army run by Google robots or what, but the fact is that companies can be compelled to do things, and as long as you have your data in the hands of a company, if that company is a foreign company, you're never going to be told what they're doing. And South African law or German law or Brazilian law may require notice, it may require a local court order, but where the law conflicts, Brazilian law and American law, or South African law and American law, the one that's going to trump is the law where the CEO is sitting. And that's Silicon Valley, that's the United States.
Let's take a quick one here, and then we're going to break for tea.
I think you should not forget to mention that Dropbox was a planned PRISM partner, and that they just had Condoleezza Rice added to their board. And I wanted to ask a question, which is not exactly related to technology, but is about expectations in the market. So for example, if you're the Hostess food company or you're McDonald's, is it allowed that the government can come and force you to put, for example, poison in your food, and then you have to go along selling that poison without notifying anyone of that? For example, you say this is the right food for mountain climbing, and they make you take out certain things that actually, if you mountain climb without it, you're in deep trouble. So they know that you'll be put in harm's way. They advertise it as a thing to help you against specific harms. Can the US government force a food company to do that? Or is this a unique thing to the technological market?
That's a really interesting question, and I didn't place that. We don't know the answer. We don't know the answer. We don't know how far the law extends. We know that courts in the US believe that they have the authority to issue orders compelling companies to provide any assistance necessary. And the million-dollar question is how much assistance is necessary and how far can the courts go before this third party, the company, before they're destroyed. This is something that I suspect may be litigated in the next few years, but what is unfortunately likely going to be the case is it'll be litigated in secret. And there's a strong incentive for the state to keep it secret, and there's a strong incentive for the companies to keep it secret, because if they lose, their reputations are destroyed. I want the answer to this question. This is why I'm so worried about this issue. The fact is that most of us don't rely on open source software we download and compile ourselves. We all rely on these large tech companies to provide us with our software, and if these companies can be secretly required to subvert the security of their products, to push out malicious software updates, to secretly enable the microphone in their products, we're screwed. I would like to live in a world where every piece of software I'm using is open source, but until we're there, I would like to make sure that the companies that we're relying on the software are working.